in the shadows of Alexandria's palaces, beneath golden ceilings where incense curled like snakes in the air, whispered stories were born. Stories not of diplomacy, not of war, but of a queen's bedroom. They were tales of forbidden rites, of horrific rituals murmured in candlelight. Stories that claimed the most powerful woman of the ancient world wielded not only armies and wealth, but desire itself as a weapon of domination. Her name was Cleopatra. And to her enemies in Rome, she was not just a queen, she was a sorceress, a seductress, a living embodiment of taboo. But what truly happened behind those doors? Were her chambers really a theater of forbidden orgies, where lust became ritual and ritual became horror? Or were these stories the twisted inventions of those who feared her, men who needed her reputation destroyed even more than her body? This is where we begin, at the dying days of the Roman Republic, a time when men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony held the fate of nations in their hands. Rome's destiny stretched across the Mediterranean, and at its crossroads stood one figure, the last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra VII. Educated, calculating, fluent in politics as well as in languages, she knew her throne depended on more than brute force. It depended on seduction, persuasion, and the power of myth. But the Romans, horrified by a woman who dared to rule in her own right, could not accept that her influence was born from intellect and strategy. No, they needed another explanation, and so they created one. They painted her private life in colors of horror. They imagined her bedchamber as an altar. They told of rituals so perverse, so grotesque, that they became legend. Picture yourself in that world. A Roman citizen hearing whispers of Egypt's queen who could unman Caesar himself, who could enslave Antony not with chains but with desire. What would you believe? Would you see her as a goddess blessed by Isis, or a temptress condemned by the gods? The truth is this: every empire has feared women who dared to rule, and history has punished them with rumor. Where a man's indulgence was celebrated, a woman's was called debauchery. Where a king's passion was seen as strength, a queen's was condemned as perversion. Cleopatra's story is no different. But here lies the dark irony. It is precisely because the myths are false that they became so powerful. Tales of her so-called horrific bedroom rituals spread like wildfire in Rome. They made her more than human, more than queen. They made her monstrous. And in making her monstrous, her enemies justified her destruction. Over the next hour, we will step into that world of whispers and shadows. We will uncover the most infamous myths of Cleopatra's bedroom, myths of honey-drenched orgies, lovers sacrificed at dawn, potions of lust turned to poison, myths that horrified even the Romans who invented them, myths that still haunt her name 2,000 years later. Because the real horror is not what Cleopatra did. It is what history chose to remember. Sex and power have always been bound together. In every age, every empire, rulers have known that the body could command as much loyalty as the sword. Cleopatra's legend lives at this crossroads, where desire is not simply pleasure, but control, weapon, and ritual. The Romans could not imagine her influence as anything but sorcery of the flesh. To them, her alliances with Caesar and Mark Antony were not strategies, but enchantments. They whispered that she had mastered forbidden rites of seduction, that her bedroom was a theater where emperors were bound, not by treaties, but by chains of lust. But this was no invention unique to Egypt. Across the ancient world, sexuality was woven into the fabric of authority. In Mesopotamia, kings and priestesses reenacted sacred marriages with the gods, a ritual binding heaven and earth through flesh. In Greece, warriors shared bonds of intimacy that were said to strengthen them in battle. Even in Rome, beneath its stern facade, concubines, mistresses, and courtesans shaped politics in ways senators would never dare admit aloud. Desire was a language of control, and Cleopatra spoke it fluently. Imagine her throne room. Golden pillars, the scent of lotus drifting through the air, her voice soft yet commanding. Every glance, every calculated gesture became a message, a promise, a warning. To those who sat across from her, the line between politics and intimacy blurred until one was indistinguishable from the other. But to Roman eyes, this mastery of desire was not skill. It was taboo. Women were to be silent, obedient, unseen. For Cleopatra, to wield sexuality as strategy was, to them, a crime against nature itself. And so, they recast her tactics as grotesque rituals, stories meant to strip her of dignity and reduce her to a figure of fear. They claimed she lured men into chambers filled with incense, honey, and wine, where nights of indulgence dissolved their will. They imagined orgiastic rites in which power was transferred not through crowns or armies, but through submission at her side. To them, intimacy was not her tool, it was her sorcery. Yet the psychology behind these myths tells us more about Rome than about Egypt. When a woman threatened the foundation of male power, she had to be rewritten, not as clever, not as strategic, but as depraved. The bedroom became her battlefield, the body her weapon, desire her poison. And so, the myth of Cleopatra as mistress of horrific rituals was born, a myth that still lingers in whispers today. But even these stories were not enough. To destroy her, Rome needed something greater than rumor. They needed scandal, a moment so shocking, so unforgettable, that it would cement her place not as queen, but as monster. And that moment was about to come. Every myth needs its spark, its origin point, the scandal that ignites rumor into wildfire. For Cleopatra, one of the first and most enduring was not on the battlefield, but in the chambers of Julius Caesar himself. The year was 48 BCE. Caesar had marched into Egypt, a land torn by civil war. Cleopatra, dethroned and hunted by her own brother, needed a desperate gamble to survive. And so, the story goes, she smuggled herself into Caesar's palace, rolled inside a carpet. When the rug was unrolled, there she was, youthful, radiant, bold beyond measure. To Roman eyes, this was no act of cunning survival. It was the grand entrance of a temptress, unveiling herself as though the scene were theatre, as though she had conjured Caesar into her web with nothing more than her presence. The scandal was irresistible. Rome imagined not a queen pleading for aid, but a seduction ritual. Whispers claimed she had bewitched the dictator of Rome, that she had bound him with secret rites of pleasure. Some even whispered of honey, perfumes, and forbidden practices brought from the East. Stories that blurred survival with spectacle, diplomacy with debauchery. From that moment, every act of intimacy in Cleopatra's life became ritual in the Roman imagination. Banquets she hosted in Alexandria were transformed in rumor into orgies of excess. Chroniclers claimed she tested the endurance of her lovers with endless feasts, intoxicating them with wine, then drowning them in sensual games. She was said to mix aphrodisiacs into their drinks, substances that sharpened desire before turning it to weakness, ensuring her dominance while her partners slipped deeper under her control. One tale even claimed that Cleopatra would stage contests, with Antony competing to see who could outdo the other in indulgence. Nights of drinking and feasting, followed by games of seduction, where dawn revealed not lovers, but captives. To Roman writers, this was no playful decadence. This was a queen performing rituals that robbed men of their strength. One chamber. At a time. The psychological weight of these stories was immense. Caesar was not just Rome's leader, he was its embodiment. If Cleopatra could enthrall him, what did that mean for the Republic? To accept her influence as political strategy would be to admit Rome's vulnerability. So instead, they created a darker truth, that Caesar had not chosen her. He had been ensnared. And with Antony, the scandal grew even more grotesque. Rome accused her of enslaving him entirely, of turning a battle-hardened general into a drunken puppet, his every decision dictated from her bed. They claimed she crowned herself as Isis, and that Antony in twisted ritual, worshipped her as living goddess while his empire crumbled around him. But the true horror was not what happened. It was what Rome believed. A woman who dared to love, to lead, to rule, reimagined as a monster who devoured men in ritual chambers of pleasure and poison. A queen transformed into a legend of excess, her every glance retold as a scandal, her every kiss as a weapon. Yet even the scandal was not the end. It was only the beginning. For as Cleopatra's story unfolded, her private life became the battlefield of empire, and her supposed rituals the justification for war. Cleopatra's bedchamber may have been the stuff of rumor, but in Rome, rumor was more dangerous than any army. Her supposed rituals of seduction and sorcery became weapons in the hands of her enemies. Every whisper, every scandal was magnified until it could topple generals and reshape the fate of empires. In Alexandria, her relationship with Mark Antony became the very symbol of this fear. To the Romans, Antony was once the embodiment of masculine strength, ruthless, charismatic, a soldier adored by his legions. But under Cleopatra's influence, he was said to have become something else entirely. Rome claimed he abandoned discipline, traded the Senate's marble halls for Egypt's silken chambers, and writers described him as bewitched, a man who had surrendered his will in grotesque rituals of submission. Some claimed Cleopatra crowned herself the goddess Isis and demanded Antony worship her as a living deity. They wrote of ceremonies where Antony, drunk on wine and passion, dressed as Osiris, kneeling before his queen as though the gods themselves demanded his loyalty. To Romans, this was more than scandal. It was treason. A general of Rome reduced to slave by a woman's bed. And the stories grew darker still. They whispered of Antony and Cleopatra forming a secret society known as the Inimitable Livers, a cult of indulgence. Their feasts, Romans claimed, turned into nights of ritualistic excess, where nobility and courtiers drank themselves into oblivion, their pleasures spiraling into chaos. To the Roman imagination, these were not parties. They were blasphemous rites, where loyalty was tested in flesh and devotion sealed in sin. But beneath the scandal lay the truth of politics. Cleopatra understood that intimacy could achieve what armies could not. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony were not mere love affairs. They were power plays, strategies to safeguard Egypt's throne against the hungry maw of Rome. Yet propaganda twisted this survival into depravity, transforming her tactics into tales of grotesque rituals. Rome was no stranger to indulgence. Emperors like Caligula and Nero would later indulge in excesses far worse than anything Cleopatra was accused of. But for them, history wrote of madness, of corruption, of emperors undone by power. For Cleopatra, the same stories became something more sinister. Accusations of female sorcery, sexual enslavement, and ritual perversion. Because in Rome, the sins of men were flaws, the sins of women were weapons. And so, Cleopatra's name was dragged into conspiracies. Senators and rivals used the image of her so-called horrific rituals to justify their betrayal of Antony, to claim he was not a traitor, but a victim, his will stolen, his soul corrupted by the Queen of Egypt. Her bed became the excuse for his fall. But whispers do not stay whispers forever. When rumor becomes scandal and scandal becomes politics, the stakes turn deadly. Cleopatra's private life had already been weaponized. Now it was about to bring war to her gates. For the common people of Egypt, the queen was not a seductress or a sorceress. She was Pharaoh, the living Isis, the one who stood between order and chaos. Her rituals were not whispered scandals, but sacred ceremonies, offerings to the gods, performances of divine duty. Yet in Rome, those same images were twisted into something obscene. What her subjects saw as holy, her enemies branded as horrific. Imagine the gulf between these two worlds. In Alexandria, the average citizen might have glimpsed Cleopatra during religious festivals, draped in gold, carried through the streets, the air filled with the music of sistrums and the chants of priests. To the people, she embodied fertility, protection, and prosperity. To them, her connection to Isis was not scandal, but salvation. But in Rome, the story was very different. There, senators and poets painted Cleopatra as the embodiment of corruption, a foreign queen poisoning the morals of their republic. They told their people that she ruled not through wisdom, but through the debasement of men. They claimed she made generals kneel, not in temples, but in bedrooms. And so ordinary Romans came to see her not as a queen, but as a threat, a woman who blurred the line between the sacred and the profane. This double vision reveals something deeper about the cultures of the time. In Egypt, sexuality could carry sacred weight. Fertility rituals, symbolic unions, even temple rites connected the human body with divine power. But in Rome, sexuality was bound by hypocrisy. The elite indulged in mistresses and concubines, yet expected women to remain silent and chaste. A man's excess was seen as strength, a woman's as sin. And so Cleopatra became the perfect villain. To Roman men, she was the nightmare of female power, the fear that desire could overthrow reason, that intimacy could topple nations. For women in Rome, her legend was both a warning and a fascination. She embodied everything forbidden: independence, authority, sexual autonomy. Where Roman wives lived under strict control, Cleopatra lived as queen, and that freedom was painted as depravity. For the slaves, courtiers, and servants in her palace, the reality was less mythic. Their lives were shaped by service, survival, and the currents of power that swirled around their queen. Some may have witnessed her banquets, her ceremonies, her moments of intimacy with Antony. But what they saw as extravagance, Rome retold as horror. Even the most ordinary acts of affection could be rewritten as ritualized corruption, once filtered through the lens of fear and propaganda. The cultural impact of these stories was immense. They created a double standard that would echo for centuries. Men's indulgence recorded as power, women's indulgence rewritten as scandal. Cleopatra's supposed bedroom rituals became a cautionary tale, repeated across generations, reinforcing the idea that when women grasp power, it must be explained away as sorcery, seduction, or sin. But myths, like fire, cannot burn unchecked forever. There comes a moment when indulgence, scandal, and rumor spill over, when the line between excess and destruction is finally crossed. Cleopatra's legend was reaching that point, and when it came, the fall would be as spectacular as the myths themselves. There is always a moment when rumor becomes destiny. For Cleopatra, that moment was her alliance with Mark Antony pushed to its breaking point, and the Roman propaganda machine seized it with merciless precision. What had once been whispers of ritual and seduction were now transformed into weapons of war. The world watched as Antony, once a hero of Rome, was recast as a broken man, enslaved by a queen's forbidden charms. Roman poets claimed he abandoned the discipline of the legion for nights of excess in Alexandria's palaces. They described him staggering through Cleopatra's halls, crowned with ivy, dressed as Dionysus, the god of wine, while the queen stood beside him as Isis incarnate. These were not lovers in the Roman imagination. They were the high priests of depravity, conducting ceremonies that mocked gods and defied morality. For Octavian, the future Augustus, this was a gift. He seized the scandal and spread it like wildfire. To rally Rome against his rival, he needed more than politics. He needed a villain. Cleopatra became that villain. He claimed she was plotting to make Rome a province of Egypt, that her horrific bedroom rituals had robbed Antony of his Roman soul. He cast their love as a sickness, their passion as treason, their intimacy as ritual corruption that threatened the Republic itself. The people of Rome believed it. How could they not? Every feast became an orgy in the telling. Every gesture of affection became a spell. Every decision Antony made was no longer his own, but the command of a woman's bed. The myth was complete. Cleopatra was no longer a queen. She was a monster. And then came Actium, the decisive battle in 31 BCE where Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's forces. The Romans told it as prophecy fulfilled. Antony, once the terror of battle, fled alongside Cleopatra when the tide turned. To Octavian, this was proof of her corruption, that a man who had led legions across the world had abandoned honor for the call of a queen's whispered promises. The turning point was sealed. Defeat was not just military, it was symbolic. The world saw Antony's collapse not as strategy gone wrong, but as the inevitable result of Cleopatra's sorcery. Her rituals had gone too far, and now they destroyed not just her lover, but her kingdom. When their armies fell, so too did their power. In their final days, Cleopatra and Antony were surrounded, their palace besieged, their future already written by Roman historians who had never stepped into her chambers, but claimed to know what horrors took place there. Antony's suicide was remembered as the act of a man broken by love, and Cleopatra's final moments became the stuff of legend. Some said she seduced death itself, embracing the asp like a final lover. Others whispered she had staged her last ritual, a queen choosing her own fate rather than kneeling before Rome. The myths had won. The queen was gone, and in her death, Cleopatra's transformation into a figure of horror and fascination was complete. But myths do not die with queens. They live on, reshaping the legacy of empires and echoing across centuries. Cleopatra was gone, but her legend had only just begun. The woman who once ruled Egypt as pharaoh was now trapped in the prison of rumor, her memory shaped not by her people, but by her enemies. Rome did not simply conquer her body, it conquered her story. And in doing so, it ensured that the myths of her horrific bedroom rituals would outlive her empire. For Octavian, soon to become Augustus, this was the ultimate victory. By turning Cleopatra into the embodiment of corruption, he justified his war against Antony not as civil strife, but as a holy crusade. He was not destroying a rival general, he was rescuing Rome from a foreign queen who had bewitched one of their own. Her image, grotesque and scandalous, became propaganda that solidified Augustus's rise as the savior of Roman morality. The consequences were immense. Cleopatra's death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Roman Egypt, but her story was rewritten to serve as a warning. For centuries afterward, she was no longer remembered as a ruler fluent in politics, science, and statecraft. She became the eternal femme fatale, the woman whose bed. And these myths did not fade with time. They grew darker, reshaped by medieval imagination. In the Middle Ages, chroniclers painted Cleopatra as a witch, a mistress of poisons, a queen whose beauty was as deadly as her bite. Her rumored bedroom rituals were transformed into cautionary tales, sermons against lust, examples of how female sexuality could lead even kings into damnation. She was invoked from pulpits as a symbol of temptation, her story wielded like a weapon to keep women silent, obedient, and ashamed of their own desires. Even archaeology has not silenced the myth. Coins show her face as regal. Inscriptions record her rule, yet the shadow of scandal looms larger than the facts. Scholars uncover fragments of her intellect, her strategies, her role as pharaoh, but still the world whispers about her bedchamber. History may present the evidence, but rumor always lingers louder. The impact stretches into our own time. Hollywood has turned her into a spectacle of seduction. Novels paint her as a siren, and conspiracy theorists still speak of her as the mistress of forbidden knowledge. Every retelling, every reinvention, circles back to the same idea, that Cleopatra's greatest power was not her throne, nor her armies, nor her alliances, but her body. That myth, born of Roman propaganda, has proven more enduring than her empire itself. And perhaps that is the true horror. Not the rituals she supposedly performed, but the way her name was transformed into a curse. The way a queen, brilliant and determined, was buried beneath 2,000 years of lies. Lies that outlasted kingdoms, shaped morality, and taught generations to fear the very idea of female power. But if myths can conquer queens, they can also haunt the world long after. Swords have rusted, and Cleopatra's myths still whisper to us today. Cleopatra's story ends in silence. Her body gone, her tomb lost, her voice drowned beneath centuries of rumor. Yet her name survives, not as the last pharaoh of Egypt, but as the embodiment of temptation, scandal, and taboo. The myths of her horrific bedroom rituals still cling to her like shadows, haunting her legacy long after her dynasty turned to dust. What is most striking is not that these myths are false, but that they endure. They endure because they serve a purpose. They remind us that history is not written by the victims, nor even by the victors, but by those who control the narrative. Rome needed Cleopatra to be a monster, so she became one. The Middle Ages needed her to be a warning, so she was cast as a witch. And modern culture, craving spectacle, has turned her into a femme fatale of the silver screen. In every age, she is remade, but always with the same theme: power through desire, punished by ruin. And here lies the deeper truth. The myths of Cleopatra are not just about her, they are about us. They reveal how societies treat women who dare to rule, who dare to wield their sexuality, who dare to stand equal to men. For men, indulgence is excess. For women, it becomes corruption. For kings, the bed is private. For queens, it is political theatre. This double standard has echoed for 2,000 years, shaping not just Cleopatra's image, but the way we tell the stories of women in power even now. Think of modern scandals. A woman politician accused of impropriety, her reputation stained by whispers, her competence overshadowed by rumor. A celebrity dragged through tabloids, her private life twisted into cautionary tales. The tools are the same as they were in Rome: scandal, sex, shame. The ritual has not changed, only the stage. And so we must ask, what else has been buried beneath the lies of history? What other rulers, queens, and leaders were rewritten as monsters to serve the needs of their enemies? How many lives were twisted into myths of horror so that power could be preserved in the hands of the few? The truth of Cleopatra may never be fully uncovered. Her tomb remains hidden, her final words lost. Perhaps she was a brilliant strategist. Perhaps she was simply a woman who dared to play the game of empires and lost. What is certain is this: the most horrific rituals were not hers but history's. Rituals of rumor, propaganda, and shame. Rituals that destroyed her image more thoroughly than any Roman sword. And so, as we close this journey into the darkest myths of Cleopatra, we are left with one final question. If myths could conquer a queen, what secrets still lie, buried, waiting to be unearthed? And when they rise, will we see the truth? Or will we create new monsters to fit the fears of our own time? Because the past does not sleep. Its shadows still whisper, and Cleopatra's whispers may never be silenced. History is not a graveyard of facts. It is a theatre of stories, staged by those who hold the power to tell them. Cleopatra's life proves this more than any queen who came before or after. She ruled, she fought, she negotiated, she loved. But what endures are the whispers. Whispers of horrific bedroom rituals that never took place, yet became stronger than truth itself. Rome feared her, so it made her monstrous. Medieval chroniclers needed a cautionary tale, so they cast her as a witch. Modern storytellers crave spectacle, so she becomes an icon of seduction. Cleopatra's true self has been lost in this endless rewriting. What remains is not the woman, but the myth. And the myth is revealing. It tells us how the world treats women who refuse silence. When men grasp for power, history calls them ambitious. When women do the same, history calls them dangerous. Kings are remembered for empires, queens for lovers. Cleopatra may have commanded fleets and armies, but to her enemies she commanded only the bed. That is the ritual history forced upon her. The tragedy is not just her death in an Alexandrian tomb, but the death of her image, buried beneath centuries of lies. And yet, the fascination remains. We still lean in when her name is spoken, still search for her tomb, still debate whether she was goddess or monster. The Romans may have thought they destroyed her, but in truth, they immortalized her. And so the question lingers: if Cleopatra can be remade into a legend of horror, who else has been rewritten by the victors of history? What rulers, what queens, what rebels have been transformed into monsters because their enemies needed them that way? Perhaps that is why her story endures. It warns us that truth is fragile, that power shapes memory more than fact, and that myths can outlast the empires that created them. Cleopatra's horrific rituals never happened, yet they are remembered. Her brilliance, her strategy, her vision, those are forgotten. This is the final ritual of history, to strip away humanity, to leave only the shadow. And so, as the torches burn low and the echoes of the ancient world fade, we must ask ourselves, what do we choose to remember? The queen who ruled Egypt, or the monster Rome invented? The answer will haunt us, because Cleopatra is not gone. She waits in the myths we still tell. She waits in the shadows. She waits in the whispers.